because everybody knows him pretty much. He's just this little known individual, Josh Hyde. But if you don't know anything about him, some things that you should probably know about him is that he has been with KCAC for 3 years and some, in different positions, from community organizer and now currently president. So that's something, right? That's something big. And not only with that, he's also been, I can't speak to it, also has been with KC Oasis since inception. So I like to say that he is a trendsetter in that regard. So, and today he has something very special to speak to us about that I think we've all been ready to hear. So if you wouldn't mind helping me bring up Josh Hyde.
All right, well, we'll deal with that. You can just look at my address bar and all my cool bookmarks. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is trying to find, as a community organizer, I've tried to find a good balance between enabling a community that is free to investigate and explore new ideas, while at the same time trying to create a community that is safe, inclusive, and positive for people. I know it may not be immediately clear why these two are necessarily not always compatible, and I'm going to go over that. And some things I say today may not be something you wholly agree with, but I hope we can all agree to disagree civilly. So before we begin, apparently I'm not going to be able to use the clicker. Ancient technology. So let's start with some definitions. So free inquiry really is a facet of free thought. The idea that someone should be free to explore new ideas without any kind of fetters or constraints imposed by any kind of authoritative source, be it some sort of religious text or overseeing committee or a singular person. The idea that we should all be able to explore these ideas and grow as individuals without having to worry about someone excommunicating us or kicking us out of our social circles or just coming down hard on us for the sole transgression of stepping outside the approved boundaries. And on the other side of that, we've got thought police. So it's really an idea that was popularized with George Orwell's 1984. It's the idea of a single individual or a group of individuals who either actively or perceived as defining from a top-down methodology what is and is not okay to accept, to discuss and explore for yourself. So what we end up with really is kind of a spectrum. On one end we've got free thought, free inquiry, and on the other end we've got thought police. This kind of dogmatic authority versus a truly free and completely unfettered liberalism, if you will. And as a community organizer, trying to create that safe, positive, inclusive community, I've been, for the past 3 years, trying to find where the best balance lies here, because as I'm going to show, there are some ideas that under the strict definition of free inquiry should be something that we enable, something we give a platform to, but I think we're all going to agree that it's not something we should legitimize. These are positions that we don't want to have legitimized in our community if we want to have it, make sure that it is inclusive and a safe space for people. So, talking about the practical realities. I'm going to go over some bad ideas here. Some of the ideas I think we as a community can agree are not something we want to enable. And so this is an ad that ran in the Minnesota Star Tribune. For those who can't see it, it says, "A male wants to shower beside your 14-year-old daughter. Are you okay with that?" And what this is it was an ad run by the Minnesota Child Protection League ahead of some provisions that would protect trans children in high schools, trans girls, trans boys, and allow them to participate in sports according to the gender. So trans girls will be able to participate in girls' sports, trans boys will be able to participate in boys' sports. And I think we can all kind of agree that this anti-trans sentimentality is not something we want to enable. To kind of, at the risk of going over the obvious, some of the things that are bad about the idea conveyed by this is, first off, it promotes the idea that trans boys are just sexual predators out to take advantage of girls. That's an idea that also escalates to, gets applied to trans women. Secondly, it promotes the idea that it is easier to go through the therapy and the hormone treatments and the risk of social ostracization and abuse that often comes an out trans person just to see a naked girl. I think we all agree that's not the easiest way to go about that. And secondly, or thirdly, it promotes the idea that teenage boys are naturally sexual predators. And while I think we need to deal with the realities of a bunch of hormone-raging teenagers and the things that can come from that, I think if we stop promoting the idea that teenage boys are naturally sexual predators who are trying to take advantage of women, it might not be such a widespread problem. Another bad idea. So can't read it. This billboard says it's not racist to love your people. WhitePrideRadio.com. This was a billboard that ran outside of Harrison, Arkansas, for a KKK radio station. I think we all agree, for a large number of reasons, that talking about how awesome it is to be white is not really an idea that we want to legitimize and give a platform to in our community, unless it's in the context of maybe a punch-up joke about white privilege. And as a third bad idea, so these were a couple of phrases that came out with a speaking Barbie doll in July 1992. If you can't read it, it says, "Math class is tough, let's go shopping." And it promotes the idea that girls and women just aren't as good as men at mathematics and things like science. And I think it's a very sexist idea. I think we all agree that there's nothing inherent about your gender or sex that prevents you from being able to competently excel in those fields. And that's an idea that we don't want to enable. Now, under the dictionary definition of free thought, though, we should be allowed to espouse these ideas, to discuss, well, maybe women aren't actually as good as men at math. And I think we can agree that if we're going to create a safe, inclusive community, we can't give these ideas a legitimate platform. We can't put people up here talking about how maybe Barbie really is right, that math is tough, and we should go shopping instead. So, those are some bad ideas. As a contrast, I want to go over some good ideas. So this is a story of a Sikh man in North Texas. He happened to find a backpack lying on the side of the road, and inside was a Bible and a prayer journal. What had happened was that there was a pastor from North Carolina, I believe, or Virginia, sorry. He was visiting family and friends in North Texas, and he had a backpack full of things like a tablet and other similar electronic toys stolen out of front of his car, and the electronics were sold, and the backpack containing the Bible and prayer journal was discarded because it really didn't have any resale value. The Sikh man found it using contact information inside of the Bible, tracked down the man who's halfway across the country, and returned it to him. And the pastor from Virginia was very appreciative of this because you can always buy your electronics back, but it's really hard to reconstitute a year's worth of prayer journal. And I think this is a good idea that we want to embrace as a community because it promotes the idea that we don't have to stop at these theological or religious boundaries to help each other. As the Oasis mantra goes, people are more important than beliefs. And so this is a good example, I think, of a good idea that we as a community agree that we shouldn't stop at whether or not we believe in a God or whether or not we believe in a different God from helping each other. Another good idea is of course, LGBTQIA advocacy. This is a picture from the panel that Brian did a wonderful job of orchestrating and conducting. And the number of reasons, of course, that it's a good idea to advocate for LGBTQIA equality is innumerable. But I think as a general principle, there is a large segment of the population that refuses to acknowledge the basic human dignity and respect due to people based on whether it be their sexual orientation, whether or not they're asexual, whether or not they're cisgender or transgender. And so we as a community, I think, can agree that it's a good idea to affirm these basic human dignities and rights to equal access to services that people who fall into that cisgendered heterosexual pool tend to enjoy. And then, as a third good idea, that's 3 for 3, multiculturalism. We all grow up in our own individual, segments of society. And our frame of reference, our worldview is dictated heavily by the people and the environment in which we grow up. And so, if we take the chance to expose ourselves to new cultures, whether it's even just different states in the United States, go over to Europe, Asia, things like that. We grow as individuals because these cultures have had to deal with problems that we may not have had to deal with, or they may have come up with solutions to problems that we've had to deal with, but done in a different and possibly even better way. So we grow as individuals and as a society as we exchange these ideas and learn from each other. And so I think we can agree as a community that this is a good idea, that, and in fact, this is a screenshot of the upcoming Chinese New Year celebration. So if you want, go on Facebook and RSVP. So, you know, I know it sounds like I'm thought police here. I'm a figure, I'm an authority figure, I'm someone in a position of power, you know, telling you what is a good and what is a bad idea. This sounds very much like the thought police definition that I raised before. But I think a critical difference here is that what I'm talking about here isn't something I've just woken up one morning and had a transcendent message into my brain that decided whether or not something is or is not right. This is part of a feedback loop that we as a community, in trying to make sure that we build a community that welcomes people of different stripes, colors, and shapes, have decided that this is how we want to define our community. These are the ideas we want to give legitimacy to. These are the ideas we don't want to give legitimacy to. This is a feedback loop up through to myself and others in various leadership positions, which then trickles down back into the community, and it's this kind of feedback loop that we just kind of learn as we go along. Now, you know, that may sound like all we've done then is distribute the thought police. Now, instead of a single authority or a single person or a single committee dictating what is right and is wrong, we've now just distributed it so that all of us dictate what is right and what is not wrong. I'm sorry, what is right and what is wrong. And I think one of the key differences then to further highlight is the fact that thought police, the typical authoritative push down, you shall not, or can you not, do these certain kind of things, tend to come from a position of without reflection. You know, we're willing to look back on our positions, the ideas that we give legitimacy to, and maybe even ideas that we don't give legitimacy to, and reevaluate them. You know, we've all done this. Myself, I did it with creationism, young Earth creationism. We've done it with, a number of us have done it with polyamory. These ideas that we may not have previously considered okay, or previously considered okay. We reevaluate them as a community, and we work together to try to figure out what is the best way to help support each other. So, we can identify bad and good ideas, right? But it helps to have a criteria. You know? It raises the question, are good and bad ideas just like pornography? Do we know a good or a bad idea when we see it, but we just can't just define it? And I think we can. We all, as a community, are leveraging these criteria to apply to ideas to determine, you know, classify them as good or bad, or maybe even just without moral valence. And I think we just need to codify them. And so what I'm going to propose here is just a rough draft. You know, this isn't a you must follow this or you cannot come back next week set of rules. This is something I want us as a community to just start with, play with, apply to new ideas and concepts as we encounter them, and learn how to and learn how to better identify what are ideas that help create this safe and inclusive community while enabling people to explore new ideas. So, I call these the 4 pillars of good ideas. I was going for 5 to maybe kind of a parallel to Islam, but I couldn't quite squeeze out the 5th. So, these are the criteria I want to propose. So first off, is it helpful? You know, when you look at an idea, let's take the ideas that I went over with before, and you ask yourself, who's being helped by these ideas? If you look at the anti-trans ad, the sexism, the racism, those ideas are helping people who want to promote that sexual superiority, racial superiority, or fear-mongering about trans people. And I think we can all agree those are not the kind of people we want to facilitate and enable in our community. Now, if you look at the good ideas, things like the Sikh helping the Christian pastor retrieve his prayer journal, the multiculturalism of exposing ourselves to new ideas and people's histories, the idea of LGBTQI advocacy and just affirming basic dignities and respect for people. there are numerous people who are helped by the idea that we can work together despite our differences, that we should assert basic dignity about people, and that we should, educate and grow ourselves using the histories and journeys of other people from other places. I think that's a good criteria to apply, asking yourself who is being helped by this idea, and conversely someone being hurt by this idea. And if it's either the wrong people to hurt or the right people, or the wrong people to help, maybe it's not a good idea. Secondly, does it hurt unnecessarily? So I put the unnecessarily there because I think it's very important. So more times than I care to admit, someone has messaged me in private and said, listen, what you said or what you did hurt my feelings, made me uncomfortable, and that made me feel bad because I had done something to make someone I care about feel bad. And so there is hurt when they tell me that I've done something to make them uncomfortable or hurt their feelings. But I think we can agree that it's a good idea because it's a necessary hurt for me to give me the chance to not only amend my behavior, but rectify any wrongs that I had done. So ideas that minimize unnecessary pain, I think we can all agree are good ideas. Thirdly, is it constructive? So this may seem a bit redundant with is it helpful up top, but it's worth calling out explicitly, I think. So I mentioned in the last bullet that people have messaged me in private saying that I did something to make them uncomfortable or hurt their feelings, and I think that's a key point. They messaged me in private because they could have taken to Twitter, they could have taken to Facebook and either called me out directly or indirectly and talked about what a horrible person I am and how I hurt their feelings. But they took that opportunity to instead message me in private, and we could work it out and explain how they felt, and not only does it help make sure that they're able to communicate to me how they feel, but it also allows me as the person who has done something wrong to help manage my public shame and embarrassment. That I subsequently from these events, I typically come out with a public apology or something like that. But if they call me out by Facebook, with a public Facebook post or a tweet on Twitter, it raises the emotional tension of any situation. It makes it a lot harder for people to resolve these conflicts because they're not talking directly to each other, and they're really just doing something that publicly shames another person. So when you talk about a good idea, when you're looking at an idea and want to determine whether or not it's a good idea to do something or a good idea to espouse, you ask yourself, is it constructive? Because you can have a really great idea, but if it's not constructive, it's never going to go beyond you. You'll think you have the greatest idea in the world, and everyone will think you're a jerk. And then the last bullet, is it reasonable? So there are a lot of seemingly good ideas that if you don't bother to scratch beneath them, turn out to be bad ideas. If you've ever read any natural law arguments against the marriage equality for same-sex couples, it's if you don't bother to scratch beneath the surface, because it's the assumption that there's a natural order to things, that nature has an intent when it comes to coupling and reproduction. And I think we can all agree that's not the case. But if you don't take the time to actually understand some of the logical fallacy beneath that, like the idea that nature has an intent, which I think we can all agree, or most of us can agree that there's not a lot of thought going behind natural processes. They do what they do, regardless of what we think about it. You need to examine these ideas, and if you're going to talk about something, make sure you have a thorough understanding. This won't mean you always do have a thorough understanding of an issue, but it means that you've at least taken the opportunity to make sure that this idea that you're going to talk about with people, to espouse, doesn't violate any of these whole criteria. And it helps keep the pool clean of seemingly good ideas that when you scratch beneath the surface turn out to be bad ideas. So that's it. That's my edict, take it or leave it, right? No, not at all. I know, like I said, people are going to disagree with me, and that's fine. I don't want you to feel like you can't come back if you disagree with the 4 pillars of good ideas, because I want us as a community to try to hone these, to apply filters, to apply them to new ideas, and if they don't work, if there's holes in them, I want us to, as a community, think about why are those holes there, and how can we fix them? You know, we may not always have 4 pillars, it may be whittled down to 3, it may go up to 80, which would be a lot of criteria to remember, but I think we as a community could manage it. But yeah, so who knows? Does anyone have questions or objections? Oh, well, let's just stick with questions. Make sure. Remember, the questions always end in a question mark. Oh, Dr. Berger.
Why weren't there any puns in your presentation?
You noticed the disappointing lack of puns, and that's because I had the flu for a week, and that was the week I was planning on putting this together, so I kind of ran out of time for it. So, yes.
What brought you to the point of actually wanting to talk about this?
So he asked, you know, what brought me to the point that I wanted to talk about this. It's been just kind of this steadily increasing discourse that I've seen over the past 3 years. An example that always sticks out in my mind was that I had a conversation with someone on Facebook, and they wanted to play devil's advocate, which, first off, if someone ever says play devil's advocate, you might be heading into dangerous territory. But they wanted to argue that maybe same-sex couples aren't as good as different-sex couples raising children. And I didn't want to do that because I think it gives legitimacy, it enables the arguments that I think are harmful and wrong. And so he kind of did this rage quit of, well, obviously the atheist movement is completely unwilling to think about maybe if it's wrong or not, and just kind of left the conversation. I don't think I've talked to the guy for a number of years, and I really hope he's not in this room. It's just trying to talk and start that conversation about what we as a community want to do to make sure that we're not only creating a safe, positive space, but also making sure that we're all able to express ourselves in constructive, positive means and to communicate with each other. Yes.
Well, I guess my question would be kind of a bigger question. Is it necessary in all forms to be able to express everything that you think or feel, regardless? One of the comments, one of the first bad comments that came up after that article was essentially, well, they say they're free thinkers and open minded, but they're not really. And that's essentially the argument, because they're not open to sexism or bigotry. And I've seen that argument used before. It's like, well, you're not very tolerant.
Yes.
And you say you're so tolerant. So, I mean, I'm curious about, because it seems like you're trying to set a boundary of, we have boundaries of free speech, which is, we have boundaries of free expression. There are places where expression is great and where expression is perhaps not as acceptable. So how much do we accept?
Okay, so sound like to paraphrase, under.
How would you, aside from Facebook, which I think is inflammatory, but if we come up and say, well, you say you're so tolerant and you shouldn't tolerate this, that people is tolerant. How would you?
So yeah, how do you deal with the
Hypocrisy accusation.
no, it's the tolerance paradox. The idea of being intolerant of intolerance while trying to still be tolerant. And it's not easy. Like I said, it's something that we as a community need to decide for ourselves. It's trying to, and also I think a key part of that is making sure this is a safe space where if we do say something wrong that hurts somebody's feelings, that somebody is not only able to say, hey, listen, that made me feel bad or that made me uncomfortable, but also that that person who has that complaint can give feedback to maybe understand, well, maybe that wasn't meant that way, or maybe the sensitivity to something didn't turn out to be the something worth being sensitive about. I used to be upset that there were people who didn't view the Bible as the one true document of the world. And you know, so I could go around telling people, listen, it really makes me upset that you don't believe in the Bible. But I should be receptive to someone saying, well, listen, there's difference of opinions, you know, not only just atheists, but Muslims and Jews and Sikhs and Hindus. And so it's about establishing really a safe place for that feedback loop, just going back to that concept of where we're able to communicate to each other. And we won't necessarily always be able to resolve our differences. I mean, they're not accounting for people who may be just stubborn and mule-headed. There may just be an unreconcilable difference of opinion there. Does that answer your question? Yes.
I guess looking at your 4 pillars of good ideas, I think you're trying to put forth, you know, some really objective criteria. But I wonder, you know, how much it is still subject to your particular viewpoint. So I'm wondering, for instance, if the White Pride Council could take a look at the topics coming into their organization and go through those same 4 pillars of good ideas and think, oh yeah, it's helpful, doesn't hurt unnecessarily, and you know, yeah, it's disruptive, reasonable, you know. And I think it depends on where you're coming from.
Yeah. So
how you evaluate those.
yeah, the question being that, you know, how do we account for the bias, my own personal bias,
Yeah.
and not only in building that criteria, but assessing the criteria. And I'm afraid to say that personal biases are unavoidable. We can try as hard as we want to not apply them, to not let them color our worldview. And I think a good way is to, again, make that a community-driven decision. And again, it still runs the risk of an echo chamber. You know, her example was, well, you get the white supremacists together and they'll apply those 4 criteria to some of the ideas and like, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, it meets all the criteria. It's constructive, it's helpful, it's not unnecessarily harmful. And so by trying to create a community, though, that invites new ideas and people of different viewpoints, I'm hoping that we can kind of help disrupt the echo chamber of biases that may result in improper or applications of those criteria that may be detrimental to our goal to create that safe, positive community. Yes?
Like, you kind of go, it seems to me like it ends up leading to the foundational principles of any community or what they're going to use as criteria for those 4 pillars. What do you think the best way for our community is to rapidly come to an agreement on what our fundamental principles are?
Okay, so the question being, we've got this base criteria, which really just maps to the underlying foundational principles of a community that we want to build. What's the process that we should use to try and figure out what those principles that we want are? And more accurately, quickly come together on those principles. And I think it's a willingness to communicate. There really isn't any kind of dictative process by which we should follow to figure this out. You know, it's just being able to communicate to each other, and equally, it's being a leadership that is open to hearing feedback and not only maintaining the privacy of people should they want it when they give that feedback, but also being able to constructively handle whether or not it is something beneficial to the community or is detrimental. And so if somebody said, listen, something Brian said really made me uncomfortable, and if they came to us as leaders, we should be able to not only have that conversation with Brian, but maybe extrapolate that, not to say about Brian because he's pretty damn awesome, but then to take that back to the community. And it's, again, at the risk of being a broken record, it's that feedback loop and just creating that openness of communication, approachability, as well as respect of privacy and sensitivity of people. So there's no bulleted list I have that we can follow with the Robert's Rules kind of rigidity. But it's and you know, screen share. And it's, like I said, it's just something I want us to, as a community, to work on, to develop. What I propose here is just a rough draft to start, not necessarily the final word on the matter. Thank you very much.